Hello and welcome back. If you're here settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, maybe pulling a blanket up a bit, good. You're in the right place. Tonight we're going to talk about Family Guy. Not the parts everyone already knows. Not the chicken fights or the cutaway gags or Peter falling on his knee for 30 seconds in the hallway and making that noise. We're going to talk about the other side of this show. The side that got it banned in at least 6 countries, pulled from streaming, refused broadcast by its own network, condemned by a federal regulator, and sued in federal court on multiple occasions. The side that generated formal protests from advocacy groups, prompted genuine internal anxiety at Fox on multiple occasions, and caused a sitting politician's daughter to release a public statement in response to a cartoon. Family Guy has been on the air since January 31st, 1999. It premiered right after Super Bowl 63, pulled in over 22 million viewers on its first night, and in the 26 years since then, it has managed to do something that almost no other television program has managed to do. It went too far, repeatedly, across almost every category of subject matter you can think of, and it survived all of it. It was cancelled twice. The second cancellation lasted 3 years, and it still came back. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when Fox greenlit the series. He had pitched the show based on 2 short animated films he'd made while studying at the Rhode Island School of Design, one called The Life of Larry and one called Larry and Steve. Fox saw something in them, gave him a development deal, and by the time the pilot aired in January 1999, MacFarlane had built a show around a completely different family in a completely different town. But the sensibility was the same. The instinct to push was the same. The willingness to go right up to the edge and then a little further. That was always there. What I find interesting, looking back at the full run of the show, is that it didn't become controversial. It arrived controversial. The network was nervous about it from the beginning. The Parents Television Council had it in their sights almost immediately. And yet the show found its audience quickly enough that Fox kept it on the air through 2 full seasons before the wheels started to come off. Tonight we're going through the moments, the episodes, the decisions, the accidents, and the actual legal proceedings that make up Family Guy's long and fairly spectacular record of going too far. Some of these stories are funny in retrospect, some of them are truly surprising, a few of them are a bit sad when you look at them closely, and one of them involves a missed flight on September 11th, 2001 that changed the course of the show's entire history. We'll get to all of it. There's no rush. Let's just start from the beginning and work our way through. The pilot episode of Family Guy is called Death Has a Shadow. It aired on January 31st, 1999, immediately following the Super Bowl. The premise: Peter Griffin gets fired from his brewery job for coming to work drunk, applies for and receives welfare, hides the welfare payments from Lois and spends the money on increasingly absurd things, is not, on paper, a particularly outrageous premise for a prime-time animated comedy. It's the kind of thing you could have pitched to a network in 1998 without anyone raising an eyebrow. And yet the network was already raising eyebrows before it got to air. The standards and practices process for that first episode was apparently fairly involved. The show had cutaway gags embedded in the structure from the very beginning, and the cutaway format created a peculiar problem for anyone trying to evaluate the content. The gags weren't plot, they weren't character development, they were asides, technically optional, technically deniable, existing in a sort of structural grey area that made it difficult to argue they crossed a specific line, while also making it obvious that the cumulative effect of them was to push the show somewhere that a conventional comedy wouldn't go. That gap between what a joke is technically and what it does practically would become the central tension of Family Guy's entire relationship with broadcast standards for the decades that followed. The show understood the gap very early on and used it deliberately. What the pilot also had going for it was the Super Bowl lead-out audience. Over 22 million people watched that first episode. Many of them had not specifically chosen to watch a new adult animated comedy from a 25-year-old creator. They were just there because the game had just ended. And so Family Guy's debut was, in a very real sense, the show arriving in living rooms uninvited, which is a slightly more fraught position than arriving in living rooms that had specifically tuned in. The show settled into a rhythm over its first season that was, by later standards, relatively grounded. The Griffin family had recognisable human problems. Peter was obtuse but not yet cartoonishly destructive. Lois was patient but had an edge to her. Meg was awkward and a little overlooked, but her parents seemed to truly care about her. Stewie was plotting world domination and the murder of his own mother, which is admittedly not standard sitcom territory, but the show framed it as a running gag rather than a genuine character study. And Brian was a dog who drank martinis and went to therapy, which is the kind of detail that is simultaneously absurd and, if you think about it for more than 30 seconds, actually quite melancholy. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog group based in Los Angeles, entered the picture early. The PTC had been founded in 1995 and had previously targeted shows like NYPD Blue and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Family Guy was exactly the kind of program they were built to oppose. By the time the show was into its second season, the PTC had begun filing FCC complaints. Over the course of the show's run, the PTC would name Family Guy Worst TV Show of the Week on at least 40 separate occasions. 40. Which is not a campaign, that's a career. That's the PTC essentially dedicating a portion of its institutional output to this one show for years on end. Their complaints focused on a fairly consistent set of concerns: sexual content, jokes about domestic violence, racial stereotypes, and what they described as the normalization of aberrant behaviour through comedy. Some of those complaints were more legitimate than others. The show did, at various points, make jokes that no competent writer would describe as defensible on craft grounds alone. But the PTC's blanket opposition to the show also meant they were crying wolf so often that it became difficult to take any individual complaint seriously, which is a problem for everyone involved. Season 2 brought a scheduling change that contributed to what would eventually become the show's first cancellation. Fox moved Family Guy from its Sunday night slot to Thursday at 9 p.m, competing directly with NBC's must-see TV lineup. The ratings dropped. The show's second season was aired irregularly, pushed around the schedule, returned at different times. It came back in March 2000 at 8:30 p.m. on Tuesdays, then moved again to Thursday evenings in November 2001. None of this was a sign of confidence from the network. By May 2000, Fox had announced a cancellation, then walked it back and ordered 13 more episodes to form Season 3. Season 3 aired from July 2001 through November 2003, which tells you something about how chaotic the production and broadcast situation had become by that point. The final episode of Season 3 didn't air on Fox at all, it aired on Adult Swim. The show's first cancellation was formally confirmed sometime after May 15, 2002, when Fox unveiled its full lineup and Family Guy was simply absent from it. No announcement, no farewell, just gone. The thing about the first cancellation is that it wasn't primarily about controversy. It was about ratings. The PTC had been campaigning against the show for years by that point, but the real issue was that Fox had moved the show around so many times and aired it so irregularly that it hadn't been able to build a stable audience. The show's problems with the network weren't entirely about content. They were also about the network not particularly knowing what to do with content it found uncomfortable. And that discomfort, that institutional unease about what the show was and where it wanted to go, would define the relationship between Family Guy and Fox for the entirety of the show's run. The show kept pushing, the network kept flinching. And the gap between those two positions is where most of the interesting stuff happened. There is an episode of Family Guy from Season 4 that is, when you think about it, one of the most audacious things a broadcast television show has ever done. It's called PTV. It aired on November 6, 2005 during Season 4, the season that followed the show's revival after its 3-year cancellation. And what it does, essentially, is take the network's real-world content battles and turn them into the plot of the episode, while making the case with considerable wit and some reasonably pointed satire that the people doing the regulating are the problem. The setup. Peter is watching a David Letterman monologue when the FCC bleeps out what is apparently an off-colour joke. Offended by the censorship, Peter launches his own uncensored television network called PTV, broadcasting from the Griffin home. He shows unedited classic programs. He develops original content. The network becomes a hit. Then the FCC shuts him down. And then in the episode's final act, the FCC begins censoring real life, bleeping audible flatulence in public spaces, issuing fines for people who undress in their own bedrooms. The show takes its satirical target and pushes it to an absurd conclusion, which is, structurally, exactly what it always does. Take a real thing, push it until it breaks, show you what it looks like when it breaks. The context for this episode matters. The Janet Jackson Super Bowl halftime incident had happened in February 2004. In the aftermath, the FCC dramatically increased the fines it could levy for broadcast indecency violations from a maximum of around $27,500 to $325,000 per incident. The broadcast landscape was in a truly anxious state. Networks were self-censoring. Standards and practices departments were under pressure. The word wardrobe malfunction had entered the cultural vocabulary in the most unfortunate way possible. Family Guy, which had returned from its 3-year hiatus in May 2005, was coming back into this environment. And rather than tread carefully, rather than return chastened and cautious, the show made an episode that directly mocked the body responsible for regulating its content. The musical number in PTV, performed by Peter, Stewie and Brian in drag, was specifically designed to generate complaints. The show knew it would. It went ahead anyway. The PTC filed formal objections, Fox received regulatory pressure, and the episode remains one of the more quietly brave pieces of television satire from that decade, precisely because it was made by a show that had already been cancelled once and was essentially daring the network to cancel it again. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox during this period was complicated in ways that went beyond the content battles. In 2007 and 2008, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. Production halted. And during the strike, Fox took the extraordinary step of airing 3 incomplete Family Guy episodes without MacFarlane's final approval. Episodes that hadn't finished their voice mixing, that hadn't received his sign-off. MacFarlane publicly condemned this. He said it damaged his relationship with the network. And the fact that Fox did it anyway tells you something about how the network balanced its commercial interests against its relationship with its own creator. The WGA situation was, in some ways, a more direct confrontation between the show and its institutional home than any content battle. The content fights were about what Family Guy said. The strike situation was about who controlled what Family Guy was. And Fox's decision to air unfinished episodes without authorization was a fairly clear answer to that question. The PTC continued its campaigns throughout this period and beyond. The complaints they filed were sometimes specific and sometimes general, but the underlying position was consistent. Family Guy was, in the PTC's view, a corrupting influence on American television and on the young people who might be watching it. The PTC's concerns about what children might encounter while watching a program that aired on Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. were at least coherent as a worry, even if the proposed solution, more regulation, more censorship, was not one that the show, or its creator, was ever going to embrace. What the PTV episode captured that the actual regulatory battles didn't was the fundamental absurdity of trying to police the line between acceptable and unacceptable humour through an administrative process. The FCC's indecency standards had to be applied consistently across a vast range of content, which meant the standards were inevitably both too broad and too narrow depending on context. The show knew this. The show made the argument in the most visible way it could think of, by turning it into 22 minutes of primetime animation, and nobody went to jail. The episode aired, people complained, Fox received the complaints, the FCC reviewed some of them, and Family Guy kept going, as it always does. There are 3 Family Guy episodes with complicated broadcast histories that tell you more about the show's actual relationship with its network, its audience, and its culture than almost anything else in the full run. 2 of them were never aired on Fox in the United States at all. One of them was pulled from streaming within weeks of a real-world tragedy, and taken together, they map out the different ways a show can go too far, through subject matter, through timing, and through the collision of both at the same time. The first one is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It was produced as part of Season 3 but held by Fox over concerns about its content, specifically a song called I Need a Jew, in which Peter, having made a series of catastrophically bad financial decisions, decides that what he really needs is a Jewish financial advisor, because Jewish people are good with money. That's the premise. Fox heard the song title and declined to broadcast the episode. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim on November 9th, 2003. It later premiered on Fox in December 2004, over a year after its Adult Swim debut, and well over 2 years after it was produced. The episode was also reported as having been refused broadcast in Canada through Teletoon. The episode itself is not, by the standards of what Family Guy would go on to produce over the following 2 decades, particularly mean-spirited. The song I Need a Jew is offensive by design, but the episode also involves Peter attempting to have his son Chris secretly converted to Judaism, which creates its own set of complications. The show is not really making a straight case that Jewish stereotypes are accurate. It's doing what it does, deploying a stereotype in a way that it expects the audience to recognise as satire rather than endorsement. Whether it succeeds in that is truly a matter of interpretation. The Bourne Company later pursued a legal dispute related to the song's alleged similarity to a copyrighted musical work, which drew trade press attention and added a whole other layer to the episode's legal history. The point is that Fox, in 2000, heard I Need a Jew and said no, and the show, rather than change the title or alter the song, just sat on the episode until a different broadcaster would take it. The second episode is Partial Terms of Endearment, and this one is a different kind of story. Partial Terms of Endearment is Season 8, Episode 22. It was produced in 2010. The plot involves Lois becoming a surrogate mother for a couple she and Peter befriend, and then the couple dying in a car accident, leaving Lois carrying a child for parents who no longer exist. She has to decide what to do. Fox refused to air it in the United States. Full stop. The episode aired on BBC 3 in the UK in June 2010. It is available on DVD. As of now, it is not on Hulu, which holds the American streaming rights to Family Guy. It is not on Disney+. More than 15 years after it was produced, Partial Terms of Endearment is officially available on at least one American streaming platform. It is the only episode of Family Guy that was made for broadcast and simply never broadcast in its home country. What makes this episode worth sitting with, beyond the obvious controversy around its subject matter, is that it's one of the more thoughtful things the show ever produced. It doesn't stake out a loud political position. It doesn't make the decision easy. It doesn't resolve into a clean message. It sits with the discomfort, which is possibly exactly why Fox didn't want it. The abortion debate in the United States is, as of the show's broadcast history and beyond, one of the most politically volatile subjects in American culture. Fox as a network had commercial relationships with advertisers and audience demographics that spanned a wide range of political opinions. Airing an episode that engaged directly and somewhat seriously with abortion in a comedy was a risk that Fox calculated wasn't worth taking. The episode went to the BBC instead. It went to DVD, and it stayed there. The third episode is Turban Cowboy, and the timing of its story is the most striking of the three. Turban Cowboy aired on March 17th, 2013. The episode contains two controversial elements. One is a plotline in which Peter befriends a man who turns out to be a terrorist. The other is a cutaway gag depicting Peter winning a Boston Marathon by driving over other runners. The Boston Marathon bombing happened on April 15th, 2013, 29 days after the episode aired. Fox and Hulu pulled the episode almost immediately after the attack. It was removed from Fox.com and from Hulu in April 2013. A hoax clip also circulated online, falsely suggesting the show had predicted the bombing, which was not accurate but spread quickly enough that it added to the pressure on the network to act. The episode had nothing to do with the actual attack. The gag about the Boston Marathon was not prescient. It was a throwaway cutaway about Peter being incompetent at sport. But the episode's terrorist subplot, combined with that one image of runners being hit by a vehicle, made it untenable in the immediate aftermath of an attack on the Boston Marathon. Turban Cowboy is still available on DVD. Its streaming availability has been inconsistent since 2013. What these three episodes share is that they each represent a different kind of institutional failure to know what to do with Family Guy's content. Fox held When You Wish Upon a Weinstein for years and then quietly released it elsewhere. Fox refused partial terms of endearment entirely and has never reversed that decision. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy after external events made the content impossible to defend in the short term. 3 episodes, 3 different problems, 3 different outcomes, and in each case the show exists in a complicated relationship with the real world, a world that sometimes catches up to its content in ways nobody anticipated. Glenn Quagmire has been in Family Guy since the beginning. He was there in the pilot. He has been in the vast majority of the show's 450-plus episodes. He is one of the most recognisable characters in the show's ensemble, possibly the third most recognisable, after Peter and Stewie. His catchphrase is known to people who have never watched a full episode, and he is, by any reasonable description, the repository of the show's most uncomfortable comedy. Cabo Agmire is an airline pilot who is, by the show's own accounting, compulsively and indiscriminately sexually predatory. The Jai-Gi-Ti catchphrase was designed to function as a kind of pressure release, a verbal tick that deflates the disturbing implications of his behaviour through absurdity. The word makes it a joke. The word creates enough distance that the joke lands as a joke rather than as something else. That gap between what Quagmire does and what the show asks you to make of it is the central problem of the character, and the show has been navigating that problem with varying degrees of success since the beginning. The thing worth noting is that the show is not entirely unaware of what Quagmire represents. There are multiple episodes where other characters explicitly register that his behaviour is predatory. Joe, who is a police officer, has acknowledged it. Brian, who is the show's moral compass in the loosest possible sense, has acknowledged it. The show doesn't present Cado Wagmire as an aspirational figure. It presents him as a figure the show has to keep around because he serves certain structural functions in the narrative. He can do things and go places that Peter, with his family responsibilities, cannot, and the show uses him accordingly. The Parents Television Council cited Cade Wagmire-related content in a number of their formal FCC complaints. The specific concerns included jokes that framed statutory rape as a comedic premise, and scenes involving coercion that were played for laughs rather than consequences. Some of those complaints were formally processed by the FCC. Some resulted in the episode being pulled, but the record of those complaints exists, and it's worth knowing about. What complicates the Cade Wagmire picture further is that the show occasionally gives him moments of genuine warmth and self-awareness. His relationship with Meg, which the show handled badly in some instances, has also had moments where the character was protective rather than predatory. The Ida Davis arc, in which Quagmire's father comes out as a transgender woman, is perhaps the most interesting example of the show using Quagmire as a vehicle for something more complex than his usual function. In Quagmire's Dad, Season 8, Episode 18, Peter's friend Glenn discovers that his father Ida has transitioned. Brian, on learning this information, goes home and vomits. The episode was criticised at the time for that moment specifically. The vomiting played as a punchline to the revelation, framing transgender identity as inherently revolting to an ostensibly liberal character. MacFarlane pushed back on that reading publicly. The episode, he argued, was ultimately sympathetic to Ida. The vomiting was about Brian's hypocrisy, not about the validity of her identity. Whether that reading is convincing is something individual viewers can decide. But the fact that the show attempted the arc at all, in 2010, was itself notable. The show that had built its most prominent regular character on crude sexual comedy was also capable, at least occasionally, of engaging with questions of identity in a way that wasn't purely dismissive. And then there's the episode where Quagmire, in the middle of a completely different storyline, delivers a monologue to Brian about everything that is wrong with Brian specifically. The monologue is extraordinary. It's detailed, pointed, personal, and merciless. It's one of the most precisely written character moments the show ever produced. And it comes from the mouth of its most morally compromised regular character, addressed to the character who is nominally the show's conscience. The show does that deliberately. Quagmire's awfulness doesn't disqualify him from having accurate opinions. That's not how people work, and the show knows it. Where Quagmire remains truly difficult is in the episodes where the writing doesn't add that layer, where the joke is simply the joke with no frame around it. There are more of those than there should be, and the cumulative record of Quagmire-related content over 25 years is one of the more complicated legacies in the show's history, not because the character is badly conceived, but because the execution has been inconsistent enough that it's truly hard to know, watching any given episode, which version of Quagmire you're going to get. That inconsistency is probably the most honest thing the show ever said about him. Not all of the controversies that Family Guy generated were about the show broadly. Some of them were about specific moments, individual jokes or scenes that landed outside the show's usual arena and prompted responses from groups who wouldn't normally be watching adult animated comedy. The clearest example of this comes from Season 4, Episode 1, The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. The episode's main plot involves Cleveland discovering that his wife, Loretta, has been having an affair with Quagmire. It's a truly consequential storyline for the show, one of the few times in Family Guy's early run where a major character relationship ends permanently. Cleveland and Loretta's marriage doesn't survive. The episode is, in its plot-level story, relatively serious for a Family Guy episode. And then there's a cutaway. The cutaway in question involves a man receiving a terminal AIDS diagnosis. It's played as a punchline. The setup is brief, the punchline is brief, and the joke is designed to land through the shock of the subject matter rather than through any particular insight about it. Several AIDS service organisations formally condemned the episode after it aired. They were not wrong about what the joke was doing. The joke was not making a point about AIDS. It was using a fatal disease as a source of shock humour. That's a real thing the show did. The response from the show was silence. The joke wasn't removed. No statement was issued. Family Guy, as an institution, did not respond to advocacy groups the way it responded to, say, formal legal proceedings. It absorbed the condemnation and continued. That pattern, absorb, continue, is actually fairly consistent across the show's entire record with organised protests. The PTC complained, AIDS organisations complained, various religious groups complained, and the show generally responded to these complaints by making more episodes. The Sarah Palin situation in 2010 was a different kind of story because it involved a specific public figure responding publicly, which gave the controversy a shape that advocacy group complaints didn't have. The episode in question is Extra Large Medium, Season 8, Episode 12. In the episode, Chris goes on a date with a girl who mentions, in a throwaway line, that her mother is the former governor of Alaska. The girl also has Down syndrome. The implication was clear to anyone paying attention. Sarah Palin had a son with Down syndrome. The show was making a joke at her expense through the character of her daughter's fictional counterpart. Palin responded publicly. Bristol Palin, her daughter, released a statement calling the joke mean-spirited. The national conversation that followed was reasonably intense for a few days, which is approximately how long these cycles tend to run. The writer of the episode then did something that reframed the entire discussion. Andrea Faye Friedman, who has Down syndrome herself and voiced the character, released her own statement. She said she found the controversy overblown. She said she had found the role empowering. She said that she thought it was important for people with Down syndrome to be represented in television, even in complicated or satirical contexts, and that she was proud of the work she'd done on the episode. That intervention made the conversation significantly more complicated than it had been. The criticism of the episode was no longer simply a case of Family Guy being cruel to a vulnerable population. It was now a debate about who gets to speak for a population and whether protective criticism from the outside is always more accurate than the views of people with lived experience. The show didn't comment much on any of this. It had made the joke. The joke had aired. And now two women, one the former governor of Alaska and one a working actor with Down syndrome, were publicly disagreeing about what the joke meant. That is truly a more interesting outcome than anyone involved probably anticipated. There's also the matter of Venezuela, which is a small footnote in Family Guy's international history, but worth knowing about. An episode involving cannabis references was reportedly banned in Venezuela. The specifics of the ban vary depending on the source, but it added Family Guy to a reasonably short list of American television programs that have been officially prohibited by a sovereign government for content reasons. The show has never made much of this, but it is there in the record. Family Guy was sued 3 times by people who believed the show had done them a specific, legally actionable wrong. The show won all 3 cases. That result tells you something useful about both how far the show was willing to push and how well the legal framework around American satire protects the kind of content Family Guy produces. The most famous of the 3 is the Carol Burnett case. In Season 4, Episode 25, Petarotica, which aired in April 2006, the show included a parody of The Carol Burnett Show, featuring a version of Burnett's iconic cleaning lady character in a sexually explicit context. Burnett sued Fox for approximately $2 million in March 2007. Burnett's claim rested on the argument that the show had used her likeness and her character in a way that she had not consented to, and that damaged her reputation. The use was intentional. The show knew exactly what it was doing and who it was referencing. It wasn't an accidental resemblance. The cleaning lady character was specifically named after Burnett's character and depicted in a way that made the parody explicit. The case was dismissed by a federal judge in June 2007. The judge's reasoning was rooted in First Amendment protections and fair use doctrine. Parody of a public figure's well-known creative work is protected expression under American law. Burnett's cleaning lady was a well-known character. Family Guy's parody of it, however crude, was legally protected. Burnett had one additional argument that the judge also rejected. She contended that Family Guy had breached an understanding that the Fox network had extended to her via a previous agreement about the use of her work in programs it broadcast. The judge found that argument unpersuasive in the specific context of the case. Burnett was gracious in defeat, publicly. The legal loss was clean, and the episode remains in circulation. The Art Metrano case was smaller in scope, but followed a similar pattern. Metrano, a comedian and actor known in the 1970s for a magic act, sued over a parody of his act in Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, a 2005 straight-to-DVD Family Guy film. The case was settled out of court after Fox's fair use defense was rejected. The Bourne Company situation around I Need a Jew from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was the most musically specific of the three legal challenges. Bourne Company, a music publisher, argued that the song infringed on a copyrighted musical work they controlled. The case drew trade press coverage and was reported on in entertainment industry publications. The details of its resolution are more complex than the other two cases, but it shares the broader pattern. The show generated a legal challenge through its content, and the legal system ultimately found in the show's favour. 3 lawsuits, 3 wins. It's a fairly remarkable record for a show that spent the better part of 3 decades specifically designing content to provoke. There's one more element from the legal adjacent history that's worth mentioning. Fox pulled an Emmy for Your Consideration promotional advertisement that Seth MacFarlane had created after newspapers refused to run it. The ad was, apparently, sufficiently provocative that even MacFarlane's own network declined to use it for awards purposes. The specifics of what the ad contained are not entirely clear from public records, but the fact that it was too much for Fox's own promotional machinery to stomach is a data point worth keeping. The show's content was sometimes too much even for the people who were trying to sell it. There is a way of watching Family Guy's treatment of Meg Griffin as a running joke, a background gag about a teenager that nobody in her own household likes, deployed for cheap laughs across hundreds of episodes. That reading is available. The show invites it in a lot of episodes. It's comfortable, and it doesn't require much. And there is another way of watching it, which is darker and more interesting and, once you've seen it, essentially impossible to unsee. From the show's earliest seasons, Meg occupies a specific structural position in the Griffin household. She is the person on whom the family's cruelty lands. Peter dismisses her. Her peers at school treat her with contempt. The show's humour at her expense is consistent and frequently merciless. She is, by the accounting of almost every other character on the show, the least valuable member of her own family. For a long time, for many seasons in fact, the show didn't seem to be doing anything with this beyond deploying it as an easy source of jokes. Meg is pathetic. That's the gag. Laugh and move on. There is an episode from season 10 that reframes all of it. In Seahorse Seashell Party, season 10, episode 2, Hurricane Irene traps the Griffin family in their house together. And in the middle of the episode, Meg, who has been enduring the abuse of this family her entire life, finally confronts them. She turns on Peter, on Lois, on Chris. She tells them exactly what they are and what they've done to her. The speech is not comedic. It's specific and direct and angry, and it lands with a force that the show doesn't usually allow in storylines about Meg, and the family is truly shaken. Peter and Lois's marriage starts to wobble. Chris has a small breakdown. The household fractures briefly under the weight of what Meg has finally said. And then Meg does the thing that makes the episode one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever produced. She goes to Brian. She tells him that she understands what just happened. She says she sees it clearly, that the family needs a punching bag, that without someone absorbing the cruelty, that cruelty circulates freely between everyone else and destroys the household. And she says she's going to fix it. She apologizes to the family. She takes it all back. She resubmits herself to the role of punching bag because she has calculated, with complete clarity, entirely consciously, that her suffering is the structural requirement for everyone else's functioning. Brian doesn't argue with her. He doesn't try to talk her out of it. He just looks at her with something that the show, in its best moments, can actually convey, a kind of quiet awe at the cost this particular choice involves. And then the episode ends. And the next episode treats Meg exactly as badly as every episode before it. But here's what that scene does permanently. Once the show has established that Meg knows exactly what her position is and has chosen it with open eyes, every subsequent joke at her expense carries a completely different weight. It's no longer a joke about a pathetic girl that nobody likes. It's a demonstration of the price one person pays to hold a broken household together. Meg isn't a victim of the family's dysfunction in any passive sense. She is, in a way that the show only articulated once and then continued benefiting from, the reason the family survives. The show went too far with Meg's treatment in another direction, in Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, Season 10, Episode 3. An episode about domestic violence that was criticised for its framing and for treating a serious subject with less care than it required. That criticism was, in many cases, fair. The episode tried something and didn't quite manage it. The subject matter was real, and the handling was inconsistent. What Meg's arc across the full run of the show actually represents, stripped of the jokes, is a decision by the show to build its most consistently mistreated character around a genuine psychological insight. That someone in a dysfunctional family can be simultaneously the most victimized and the most indispensable, and that those two things aren't separate from each other. They're the same thing. That's not a gag, that's a thesis. For 21 years, Kaylee Vueland Brown was voiced by Mike Henry. Henry is white. He voiced Cleveland from the first season in 1999 through season 19, which ended in 2021, a span that encompasses both the original run of the show and the entire post-revival era, through the Cleveland show spin-off and Cleveland's return to KWO Hog in season 12. In June 2020, Henry announced that he was stepping down from the role. His statement was direct and gracious. He said that people of colour should play characters of colour, and that he recognised the role didn't belong to him. Arif Zahir was announced as the new voice of Cleveland on September 25th, 2020, starting with season 19. The Cleveland recast happened in the middle of a broader industry conversation about white actors voicing characters of colour in animated television. Apu on The Simpsons and Dr. Hibbert on The Simpsons were recasted or had voice casting reconsidered during the same period as Cleveland. But Bob Belcher on Bob's Burgers and Principal Shepherd on Family Guy were not. Family Guy was not alone in this, and Henry was not alone in stepping aside. But the Cleveland situation had a particular history attached to it that the other recasts didn't quite have. Cleveland had been given his own spin-off series. The Cleveland show ran on Fox from 2009 to 2013. 4 seasons, 88 episodes, a substantial investment of network resources in a character played by a white actor in a show that centered a black family. The spin-off was created by McFarlane, Richard Appel, and Mike Henry. When it was cancelled in 2013, Cleveland and his family returned to KWO Hog in season 12 of Family Guy. The spin-off was, at least in part, an attempt to give Cleveland fuller development than Family Guy's ensemble format allowed. Whether it succeeded is something viewers assess differently. The show had its defenders and its critics, but the question of who was playing Cleveland was presumably discussed during its production, and presumably not considered a significant enough issue to address at the time. By 2020, it was. The show's broader record on race is truly mixed. The PTC's complaints had repeatedly cited racial content, stereotypes applied to various groups, cutaway gags that deployed ethnic humour in ways that were more comfortable when the show's predominantly white writing staff were the ones deciding what was funny. Some of that content held up worse than others over time. Some of it was satire. Some of it was the show enjoying a joke that it had dressed up as satire, but hadn't really bothered to interrogate. Cleveland's recast didn't retroactively Arif Zahir replace Mike Henry as the voice of Cleveland Brown in Family Guy, but there is not enough concrete public data to state definitively that the show's production team was not particularly diverse for most of its history. Not particularly diverse, but the recast was a genuine institutional acknowledgement that something needed to change, delivered in a way that was clean rather than defensive. Henry has said that he is proud of the work he did with the character and that he believes the change was right. That's a hard thing to say about something you spent 21 years doing. He said it anyway. On November 24, 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Life of Brian. In the episode, Brune Griffin is struck by a car outside the Griffin home. He's taken to the vet. He dies in the waiting room, surrounded by the family, while Stewie stands beside him and tells him it's all right to go. The scene is played with genuine weight. There are no cutaway gags. There is no comedic deflection. Brune Griffin, the Griffin family dog, dies on screen, and the show lets the death be what it is. The immediate audience response was extraordinary in its intensity. Social media went into something approaching collective grief. A Change.org petition calling for Brian's return gathered tens of thousands of signatures within days. Fans who had watched the show for years reacted with a level of genuine distress that caught some observers off guard. This was, after all, an animated character in a comedy series. But Brian was not a background figure. He was the show's emotional spine in ways that the other characters weren't. He was the one who seemed to actually feel things. He was the one whose disappointments registered as real disappointments rather than setups for the next gag. Fox introduced a replacement dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, best known as Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. And for 2 episodes, Brian was gone. The show tried to make Vinny work. The audience largely did not accept this. And then, in Christmas Guy, Season 12, Episode 8, Stewie uses time travel to go back and prevent the accident. Brian walks back into the house alive on Christmas morning. The family hugs him. Stewie hugs him. And that was that. MacFarlane said in the aftermath that the resurrection had been planned all along, that the arc was always going to be resolved before Christmas, that the 2-episode absence was designed to give the audience a genuine emotional experience of loss before restoring what they'd lost. Whether that was true from the beginning, or whether the intensity of the fan response accelerated a timeline that had more flexibility in it than anyone was admitting, is something only people inside the production know for certain. Both readings are available. What the arc exposed, either way, was the depth of the audience's attachment to a specific character in a show that had, over the years, trained its audience to not take character deaths seriously. People and recurring characters on Family Guy had died before, usually as jokes, usually without consequence, usually with the character reappearing in subsequent episodes with no explanation. Death had been a throwaway on Family Guy for years. Brian's death didn't feel throwaway, which is why the audience's response was so disproportionate to what the show would normally generate. For the IMDb rating for the Family Guy episode, Life of Brian, is lower than average for the show, but not among the very lowest in the show's history. In the show's history. That low rating wasn't primarily a critical judgment. It was an expression of audience anger. People felt manipulated. They had given the show the emotional response it was asking for, and then the show turned around 2 episodes later and said essentially that the grief had been borrowed rather than earned, that the show had asked for something real from its audience and then given it back with a just kidding attached. Whether you find that worse than if the death had been permanent is an interesting question. A permanent death would have been brave, and for many fans, unbearable. A temporary death followed by a resurrection was dramatically unsatisfying, and for many fans, manipulative. The show managed to generate both responses in the space of about 3 weeks of broadcast time. Brian came back. He's still there. He's been there ever since, and the show learned something from that arc. Not necessarily about storytelling, but about the specific quality of the attachment that its audience had to this particular character. The audience would endure a lot from Family Guy, but Brian was the line. Family Guy has been having an argument with organised religion since its first season. It has depicted God as a recurring character. It has depicted Jesus as a recurring character. It has depicted the Catholic Church, evangelical Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in ways that ranged from pointed satire to jokes that were simply looking for a reaction. And it has done all of this without ever fully resolving where it actually stands. The early season's religious comedy was pointed but not particularly vicious. God appeared in a handful of episodes as a figure whose divine authority could be deflated through absurdism. A celestial being who was also, somehow, just a bit of a bloke. The jokes were irreverent in the way that a lot of American comedy has always been irreverent about religion. Not hostile to individual faith, but skeptical of institutions and willing to get a laugh from the gap between what religious authority claims to be and what it actually looks like from the outside. Jesus appeared early in the show's run and returned periodically across the seasons. The show's treatment of Jesus was generally gentler than its treatment of institutional Christianity. Jesus was often depicted as more sympathetic than the organizations that claim to act in his name, which is a somewhat standard comedic move, but not an entirely dishonest one. The post-revival escalation changed the texture of the religious comedy. By the mid-seasons, the show was willing to go places it hadn't gone in the early years. Catholic organizations filed complaints. The show's treatment of religious content became a regular source of PTC concern, and the asymmetry in how the show handled different religions became a subject of genuine critical discussion. The asymmetry was real. The show was willing to make certain jokes about Christianity, particularly Catholicism and evangelical Protestantism, that it approached differently when it came to Islam. Some of that differential treatment was simply a reflection of the post-9/11 cultural environment in which the show was operating. In the years following September 2001, the decision calculus around religious comedy was truly different depending on which religion you were writing about, and the show navigated that unevenly. Peter's Catholicism is one of the show's more consistent character threads, though it's usually played as a source of irony rather than genuine belief. Peter is Catholic in the way that a certain kind of American man is Catholic, culturally, historically, with no particular interest in what it actually asks of him. His relationship with the church is a relationship with habit rather than faith. The show uses this consistently and without much affection for what it's depicting. Family Guy, Season 8, Episode 2, takes a different angle. Lois discovers she's technically Jewish by ancestry, which triggers a family religious crisis. The episode walks a line between satire and stereotype, and mostly lands on the right side of it, though with enough edge to generate complaints from Jewish advocacy grow. The most interesting religious episode in the show's later run is probably the Season 17 premiere, Married with Taish, with cancer, or more accurately, the adjacent Season 17 storyline in which Peter dies and speaks directly with God. Speaks directly with God. The scene is played with more sincerity than the show usually allows in its religious content. It's not a parody. It's not a joke about how silly religion is. It's a character in genuine crisis having a conversation that the show frames as real within the logic of its universe. That choice, to play religion straight when the show needed emotional stakes, is its own kind of statement. The show could be dismissive about faith when it wanted to be. When it needed faith to mean something, it made faith mean something. Whether that consistency holds up across the full run is a question the show probably could not answer with full candour. The argument with Family Guy has been renewed through Season 27, renewed through Season 28. God will presumably appear again. Jesus will probably drop by, and the PTC will file whatever complaints seem appropriate. On the evening of September 10th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was in Rhode Island. He had gone back to the Rhode Island School of Design, the place where he first developed the characters that would eventually become Family Guy, to give a lecture. After the lecture, he went out for drinks with some of the faculty. He had a few too many. He stayed out too late. He went to bed later than he should have, given what the following morning required. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport, bound for Los Angeles. His travel agent had listed the departure time on his itinerary approximately 10 to 15 minutes later than it actually was. Between the hangover and the incorrect time on the itinerary, MacFarlane arrived at the airport after the gate had closed. The woman at the counter told him he was too late. He asked to be rebooked. He went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up to the sound of commotion. The news was already running on the monitors in the lounge. He watched the coverage unfold, watched the second plane hit the South Tower, and then heard them announce which flight had struck the North Tower. It was American Airlines Flight 11, the flight he had been booked on, the one he had missed by 15 minutes because he drank too much the night before, and his travel agent wrote down the wrong time. There were 92 people on board that flight. All of them were killed. MacFarlane has discussed this publicly over the years. In interviews, he has approached the subject with a mixture of dark humour and genuine sobriety. The dark humour being, apparently, his natural mode of processing things that he doesn't have adequate words for. He has said it rattled him for a while. He has said he doesn't spend much time thinking about it in his daily life. He has said various things in various contexts, none of which quite add up to a settled relationship with the fact of what happened and what it means. Family Guy had been cancelled by Fox in May 2002, 8 months after September 11th. The show was already gone, and then Adult Swim started airing reruns in April 2003. The ratings were strong, stronger actually than the show had ever managed during its original broadcast run. DVD releases of seasons 1 and 2 appeared in the same week as the Adult Swim premiere and sold at a pace that caught everyone by surprise. Fox ordered 35 new episodes in May 2004. The show returned in May 2005. The revival of Family Guy was, as it has been noted in various industry contexts, the first television revival primarily driven by DVD sales and syndicated rerun ratings rather than by conventional network metrics. That model has since influenced how networks think about cancelled shows, about streaming rights, about the difference between a show's broadcast audience and its actual audience. All of that is downstream of a hangover and a wrong time on an itinerary. If MacFarlane had made that flight, Family Guy ends at season 3. No revival, no post-revival expansion into Star Wars parodies and Stewie and Brian road trips and dark character studies in therapists' offices. No partial terms of endearment, no Cleveland recast, no Life of Brian, no further decades of controversies and lawsuits, and FCC complaints, and banned episodes, and PTC awards for Worst Show of the Week. Just a short-lived animated sitcom from a 25-year-old creator, buried in the back pages of television history, cancelled after 3 seasons and never heard from again. But he didn't make that flight. And so here we are, talking about everything the show went on to become. Good and bad, funny and awful, brave and cowardly, sincere and cynical. All of it existing because of a missed gate and a wrong time on a piece of paper. There's no clean moral to that. It's just the fact of it, sitting in the history of the show like a stone in a river. With Everything Season 16, Episode 12 of Family Guy is called Send In Stewie Please. It aired on March 18th, 2018, aired on April 15th, 2018. It was the show's 300th episode. The premise? Stewie is sent to a child psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield after an incident at school. The entire episode takes place in the therapist's office. There are no cutaway gags. There is no B-plot about Peter doing something catastrophic. There is no slapstick, and no violence, no musical number. There is no relief valve of any kind. It is 22 minutes of a baby and a therapist having a conversation. Nothing else. Stewie begins the session, as Stewie always begins everything, with his defences fully engaged. He is sarcastic, combative, analytically aggressive. Within the first few minutes of meeting Dr. Pritchfield, Stewie has deduced intimate details about the man's personal life from small observable cues. He is performing intelligence as deflection, dazzling so that nobody has to look past the dazzle at what's underneath. The performance is familiar. It's the Stewie we know. Dr. Pritchfield doesn't flinch at it. He doesn't rise. He does express admiration at the deductions and irritation at the insults. Irritation at the insults. He is simply patient. And that patience, the specific, professional patience of someone who has learned not to give deflection what it's looking for, begins, slowly, to work. Stewie admits that he's lonely. He admits that the English accent, the whole upper-class British affectation that has defined his speech for 17 seasons, is a facade. A performance he invented at some early point in his development because he needed distance. Because if he talked like a normal child from Rhode Island, people might see him clearly. And if people saw him clearly, they might find what was there insufficient. The accent is armour, it always was. He admits that he doesn't know who he actually is underneath the character he plays, that the character has been running so long, it may have consumed whatever was under it. And then Dr. Pritchfield has a heart attack. He collapses, he's dying, and Stewie watches. He doesn't call for help. He doesn't press the emergency button. He lets the one person who has seen through his facade, the one person who understood what the performance was and why it existed, die. Because if the therapist lives, someone knows. Someone has seen the real Stewie and can describe what they found. And Stewie cannot allow that. He rebuilds his defences before the body is cold. He puts the accent back on. He reconstructs the character. He leaves the office as the version of himself that keeps the world at a distance. The audience response was divided in interesting ways. Some viewers found the episode one of the most accomplished pieces of television the show had ever produced. An argument that Stewie was, underneath 22 minutes of stripped performance, a truly tragic character, and that the show had been hiding that tragedy in plain sight for 17 years. Some viewers found the emotional exposure uncomfortable in a way they couldn't quite articulate. Some viewers found the episode, quite simply, too much. What the episode went too far doing, in a way that is different from everything else in this video, is that it made Stewie human. It took the character, who had always been a comic engine, and showed you what was powering the engine. And what was powering it was loneliness so deep that it was capable of letting someone die rather than be known. That revelation doesn't go away. You can't unwatch it. Stewie goes back to plotting world domination in the episodes that follow. But the episode exists, and it pulls at everything around it. When Stewie makes a joke in season 17 or season 18, part of what you're hearing is a character who sat in a room and told a therapist the truth, and then watched the therapist die to keep it secret. The show doesn't acknowledge this. The show continues as though Send in Stewie Please is just one more episode in the run. And that non-acknowledgement is its own kind of statement. The show went somewhere true, and then retreated, the way a person might say something honest at 2 a.m, and then, in the daylight, act as though it never happened. Whether that's a failure of nerve or a deliberate creative choice is, depending on how you read the show, either deeply frustrating or entirely in keeping with what Family Guy has always been. There is a version of the argument that says, Family Guy's most controversial moments are mitigated by the fact that the show has always known what it was doing. That the self-awareness built into its structure, the meta-commentary, the in-jokes about its own format, the PTV episode that turned its content battles into satire, represents a kind of intellectual honesty that raw condemnation of the content misses. And there is a version of the argument that says self-awareness is not a moral defense, that knowing you're going too far and going anyway is not the same as not going too far, that the sophistication of the joke doesn't change what the joke does. Both of these arguments are available. The show has been generating both of them simultaneously for its entire run. What the self-awareness does accomplish practically is that it makes Family Guy truly difficult to dismiss. You can't accuse the show of being unaware of its own excesses, it's too obviously aware of them. The PTV episode was made by people who understood exactly what the FCC was doing and why it was problematic. Send in Stewie, Please was made by writers who knew what Stewie's psychological defences meant and chose to expose them on the 300th episode specifically. The episodes where Family Guy acknowledged that Meg knew her own role in the family's dysfunction were made by people who had thought about what that dynamic actually meant. The self-awareness doesn't exonerate the AIDS joke. It doesn't make the Quagmire content more defensible. It doesn't explain why partial terms of endearment remains officially unavailable on any American streaming platform 15 years after production. But it does mean that Family Guy is a show that has been in dialogue with its own controversies in a way that most television programs are not. It has made arguments about its own content through the content itself. It has pushed back against regulatory pressure by making the pressure part of the show. It has, at various points, been more honest about what it was doing than anyone who complained about what it was doing gave it credit for. MacFarlane's public persona contributed to this. He is not a creator who retreats behind his work when criticism arrives. He is engaged with controversies, sometimes gracefully and sometimes less so, but consistently. His Emmy hosting, his interviews, his willingness to take positions on political and cultural matters that extended well beyond his role as a television producer. He has been part of the conversation about Family Guy in a way that shaped how that conversation was conducted. The show's relationship with its own worst moments has also changed over time. There are jokes from the early seasons that the writing staff would not make now, not because the show has become timid, but because the specific comedy of those jokes has dated in ways that make the gap between the joke's framing and its effect visible in ways it wasn't when the episode first aired. The show has evolved unevenly in the direction of something more considered, while also retaining enough of its original instincts to remain recognisably itself. Brian's novel in the show getting universally panned is a moment of self-deprecation that the show truly earned. The joke about Brian's pretensions as a writer lands because the show has the intelligence to recognise pretension in itself. That kind of double vision, seeing yourself clearly enough to mock the performance you're giving, is rarer than it looks. Whether it's enough, whether self-awareness plus craft plus intelligence adds up to an account of itself that Family Guy can sustain. That's the question that doesn't have a clean answer. The show keeps going, the controversies keep coming, and the self-awareness keeps being deployed as something between a defense and a confession. Family Guy is currently renewed through season 28, which takes it to the 2028-2029 television season. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999. If it runs through season 28, that will be a 30-year run for a show that was cancelled twice before its 5th season. The numbers around the show's current status are worth noting. The Comedy Central licensing deal was announced in August 2024, with broadcasts beginning in September 2024. Adult Swim announced its return to the Family Guy library in late 2024, with new reruns beginning in 2025. The show's season 23 began with a Hulu special in October 2024, followed by the Fox premiere in February 2025. Season 24 followed a similar pattern, with a Hulu Halloween special in October 2025 and the Fox premiere moving to February 2026. The distribution landscape for Family Guy looks nothing like it did in 1999. The show that Fox struggled to schedule and eventually cancelled is now spread across Fox Broadcast, Hulu Streaming, Disney Plus internationally, Comedy Central and Adult Swim simultaneously. The audience for a single episode in 2025 is not the opening night crowd that gathered after the Super Bowl, but the cumulative reach of the show across all its platforms is probably larger than any individual broadcast number ever was. The Cleveland recast has settled in. Arif Zahir has now voiced Cleveland for several seasons, and the recalibration that came with the change has become part of the show's ongoing identity rather. The 2023 WGA strike paused new writing work on Family Guy. MacFarlane and the showrunners walked off during May 2023, joining the broader industry action. Production resumed after the strike's resolution. The pattern of the show, adapting to external pressures and continuing, is at this point one of the defining features of its institutional history. The 25th anniversary EP, released digitally in 2024, included You Have AIDS, Shipoopy, and Prom Night Dumpster Baby, the show's own selection of its most iconic musical moments. The fact that You Have AIDS is on that list, given that the show's AIDS-related content had drawn formal protests from our advocacy organisations at various points, is a small detail that says something about how the show has chosen to curate its own legacy. The list of things Family Guy has done and survived is long. Named Worst TV Show of the Week 40 times by the PTC, sued 3 times and won every time. Cancelled twice, banned in Venezuela. 3 episodes with complicated or absent broadcast histories. Formal protests from multiple advocacy groups. A replacement actor announcement that became part of a broader industry reckoning. A character death that generated a national grief response. A therapist's office scene that exposed the show's most iconic character in ways it never fully followed through on. And through all of it, the show kept going. Peter kept being Peter. Stewie kept performing the accents. Brian kept drinking and not finishing the novel. Meg kept absorbing the damage. The show that went too far for 30 years is still going. So that's where we've been tonight. We've been through the pilot and the early nervousness of a network that had greenlit something it didn't quite know how to handle. We've been through the FCC war and the episode that turned regulatory pressure into primetime animation. We've looked at the 3 episodes that either never aired in America, got pulled from streaming after a bombing, or have spent 15 years available only on DVD. We've thought about K.W. Agmire and what it means that the show kept him around for 25 years without ever quite resolving the tension he embodies. We've talked about the protests and the Sarah Palin situation, and the woman who reframed that whole conversation in one public statement. We've gone through the lawsuits, all 3 of them. We've sat with Meg and what the show was actually saying about her. That one time it said it clearly. We've looked at the Cleveland recast and what it meant for a show with that particular history. We've been through Brian's death and what it revealed about the quality of the attachment the show had built with its audience. We've spent time with religion and with God, who is apparently available for conversation in KWO Hog if you're the right sort of person. We've gone back to September 10th, 2001, and the 15 minutes that changed the show's entire trajectory. And we've sat in that therapist's office with Stewie for 22 minutes and then watched him rebuild his walls before leaving. The thread running through all of it is a show that was always going further than anyone expected. Sometimes that produced something truly good, something true and emotionally resonant that the format of a primetime animated comedy is not supposed to be capable of producing. Sometimes it produced something that deserved every complaint it received. Often both in the same episode. MacFarlane missed that flight in September 2001 by 15 minutes. Everything that followed, every banned episode, every lawsuit, every protest, every FCC complaint, every moment the show went too far and kept going, is downstream of a hangover and a wrong time on an itinerary. It's renewed through season 27, renewed through season 28. Peter will keep falling on his knee in the hallway. Stewie will keep rebuilding his defences. Brian will keep not finishing the novel. Meg will keep absorbing the damage. And somewhere in the next 4 seasons, the show will almost certainly go too far again, in some new way that nobody has quite anticipated yet. That's Family Guy. 26 years in, still on the air, still generating the kind of conversations that cartoons about fat men from Rhode Island are not really supposed to generate. It went too far. It kept going. It's still going now. Going back to that first season for a moment, there's something worth noting about how the show handled its earliest episodes that gives you a clearer picture of what was actually happening in those writers' rooms. The show was not simply being Provost Seth MacFarlane, has a background in animation and in comedy that trades on the gap between what is said and what is meant. Joke and the target of it. The cutaway structure was central to this from the very beginning. A cutaway gag operates in a fundamentally different register from plot-based comedy. It interrupts the narrative to deliver something that the narrative would never deliver on its own. The cutaway doesn't have to follow the rules of the story. It has its own rules, or rather, it has the freedom to operate with fewer of them. The show understood this almost immediately and used that freedom aggressively. What Fox's standards and practices team was dealing with in those early seasons was a format they hadn't quite encountered before. The Simpsons had been operating for a decade by the time Family Guy premiered, but The Simpsons was a different animal. It pushed limits within a narrative framework that maintained certain recognizable rules. Family Guy's cutaway structure made it possible to deploy content that bore no relationship to the story being told, which made the traditional process of evaluating content scene by scene significantly more difficult. The show's early seasons also had a warmth to them that the post-revival era lost somewhat. There are episodes in seasons 1 and 2 where the Griffin family behaves with something approaching genuine tenderness toward one another. Peter's love for Lois in the early seasons is presented as real and somewhat moving in spite of everything. Meg is occasionally treated as a character rather than a punchline. The show had an emotional core that the aggressive comedy was in service of rather than in opposition to. That core was not what generated the controversy. The controversy came from the gags that existed alongside it, the asides, the cutaways, the jokes that the show was making in the margins of its own story. And the tension between the show's emotional sincerity and its comedic aggression is part of what made it interesting in those early years. The show was trying to be two things at once sincerely. It didn't always succeed, but the attempt was there. The second cancellation, confirmed in May 2002, happened for reasons that were more about scheduling and network strategy than about the content itself. Fox had moved the show around so many times that it had never been able to build the kind of consistent audience that justifies the investment. But the content concerns were never entirely absent from those decisions either. A show that made standards and practices nervous was always going to be the first to go when the ratings gave the network an excuse to cut it. What the Adult Swim years revealed, the 2003 to 2005 period when the show was airing in reruns on cable late at night, was that there was an audience for Family Guy that the Fox broadcast model had never quite reached. A younger audience, watching later in a context where the show's aggression felt appropriate rather than inconvenient. Cable had different standards than broadcast. Adult Swim had different standards than Fox, and in that more permissive environment, the show found the audience it had been looking for all along. The mechanics of the FCC complaints process help explain why the PTC's campaign against Family Guy was always more about pressure than about outcomes. The FCC's indecency standard prohibiting content patently offensive by contemporary community standards sounds robust until you try to apply it consistently across a vast range of content, at which point it becomes obvious that community standards are neither contemporary nor consistent. They vary by region, change over time, and mean different things to different reviewing bodies. It is, in other words, the kind of regulatory standard that sounds authoritative from a distance and gets considerably murkier up close. The FCC is also constrained by the First Amendment, which limits the government's ability to regulate content even on broadcast television. The result is that the FCC's indecency enforcement has been, historically, inconsistent and frequently reversed on appeal. The fines that the FCC levied against various broadcasters in the post-Janet Jackson period were largely overturned by federal courts. The legal framework that the PTC was relying on to pressure Family Guy into reforming its content was not as solid as the volume of complaints might suggest. MacFarlane knew this. He had lawyers, he had a network behind him, however uncomfortably, and he had the specific advantage of being a creator who understood the regulatory landscape well enough to satirize it in prime time. The PTV episode was not made in ignorance of the legal and regulatory reality. It was made with a fairly clear understanding of exactly where the limits were. What's interesting about the WGA strike situation from 2007 and 2008 is that it exposed a different kind of tension in MacFarlane's relationship with Fox. Not a creative tension or a content tension, but a control tension. Fox owned the show. Fox had the right, as the broadcast entity, to make decisions about what it aired. MacFarlane had creative control within certain limits, but those limits were defined by a commercial relationship that ultimately gave Fox the final word on when and how episodes were broadcast. The 3 incomplete episodes that Fox aired without MacFarlane's authorization during the strike were not, in themselves, a catastrophic creative failure. The episodes were essentially finished. But the principle of the thing mattered to MacFarlane, and his public condemnation of Fox's decision was a rare instance of a creator directly criticizing their own network's handling of their work during a period of industrial action. It didn't change anything. Fox was the network. The episodes aired. MacFarlane continued making the show, but the incident is a useful data point in understanding the nature of the relationship. A relationship that was commercially productive and creatively contentious in approximately equal measure for the entirety of its run. The PTC's record of naming Family Guy Worst TV Show of the Week 40+ times has a certain tragicomic quality when you look at it from the outside. The award, such as it is, was clearly not functioning as a deterrent. If anything, the PTC's consistent opposition to Family Guy probably contributed to the show's cultural profile. Being condemned 40 times by a conservative watchdog organisation is a form of publicity, and it reinforced the show's identity as something transgressive and worth paying attention to. The PTC may have been one of Family Guy's most inadvertent long-term promotional partners. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein situation has an additional layer to it that gets missed in the straightforward telling. The episode wasn't just held because of I Need a Jew as a song title. It was held because the entire premise engaged with Jewish identity in a way that Fox apparently didn't know how to evaluate. The song title was The Sharp Edge, but the episode around it was actually something that defied easy categorization. Peter's decision to befriend a Jewish man and then attempt to secretly convert Chris to Judaism is, when you think about it, a fairly complex joke. The punchline isn't that Jewish stereotypes are accurate. The punchline is that Peter is so credulous about them that he reorganizes his family around them, which is a joke about Peter's gullibility and the way cultural stereotypes circulate as received wisdom. Whether that distinction holds up in a title called I Need a Jew is a fair question. But the episode itself is doing something more interesting than the title suggests. Fox held it anyway, which tells you that the distinction between a title and its content matters less, institutionally, than whether the title is going to generate a crisis. The BBC Three broadcast of Partial Terms of Endearment in June 2010 is an interesting footnote in the episode's history. BBC Three was, at the time, one of the UK's most adventurous broadcast channels for adult comedy. It had broadcast episodes of American animation that Fox and other networks had declined, and it had a mandate to take risks that a commercial broadcast network like Fox did not have. The episode airing there was entirely sensible, editorially. It just happened to reinforce the fact that an episode of an American show made for an American audience about a political subject that is central to American political life, was being watched in America only by people who owned the DVD. There's something slightly absurd about that when you lay it out plainly. The episode exists. American audiences who want to see it can buy a DVD or find it through other means. It's not suppressed in any meaningful sense, but it being unavailable on any official American streaming platform, years after Family Guy moved to Hulu, years after the Disney acquisition made the show's back catalogue part of a massive streaming library, is a decision that has been renewed repeatedly. Someone keeps deciding again and again that this particular episode stays off the American streaming platforms. That's not inertia, that's a maintained position. The turban cowboy situation deserves a bit more attention on the hoax clip element, because that aspect of the story is a product of a specific media environment, the early days of viral sharing, that didn't exist when the show was in its first run. The hoax clip that circulated after the Boston Marathon bombing wasn't a sophisticated deception. It was a rough edit that combined footage from the episode with news coverage of the attack in a way that suggested the show had predicted, or more absurdly, inspired the bombing. The claim was false. The clip spread anyway. And Fox's decision to pull the episode from streaming was in part a response to that misinformation circulating alongside the real-world tragedy. That dynamic, a television programme being pulled from circulation because false claims about it were spreading faster than accurate ones could follow, is something that becomes more rather than less real. The episode was pulled because of what it actually contained. Had it actually contained, it was pulled because of what people were saying it contained. Whether those are the same thing from a network's perspective is the kind of question that gets decided very quickly in a crisis. The specific question of what the show does when Cader Wagmire's behaviour is framed as consequence-free versus when it's framed as something that has real weight is one of the more instructive, analytical exercises you can apply to the full run. The ratio shifts depending on the season. In the early seasons, the consequence-free framing dominated almost entirely. The GIGT functioned as a full stop. It ended the gag, closed the bracket, and moved the episode on. No aftermath, no follow-through. The joke was entirely in the moment. As the show aged, particularly in the middle and later seasons, the writing staff began to use KB Wagmire differently. The Ida Davis arc is the clearest example of this. An episode that asked the audience to sit with Cade Wagmire's emotional response to a situation that had nothing to do with his usual comedic function, and to take that response seriously. Whether or not the episode succeeded in every respect, the attempt to use Cabu Wagmire as a vehicle for something other than shock comedy was a significant creative choice. The Brian Cader Wagmire antagonism is perhaps the most consistent example of the show's self-awareness about both characters. Cader Wagmire despises Brian. His reasons are specific and, frankly, not entirely unreasonable. He thinks Brian is a fraud, a poser, a dog who performs liberal intellectual credentials without any of the follow-through that would make those credentials meaningful. The monologue he delivers to Brian in Season 8 is, word for word, one of the more precisely written character speeches in the show's entire run. It is also delivered by the show's most morally compromised regular character, and the show leaves you with both of those facts simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them. That refusal to resolve is actually quite sophisticated. The show is telling you that Cader Wagmire can be correct about Brian without that correctness making KW Wagmire admirable. That accuracy isn't a character trait, it's just a thing that happens to emerge from a specific set of observations. The smartest person in the room is sometimes the worst person in the room. The show has always known this, and K. Wagmire is probably the character it uses most consistently to make the point. What the PTC complaints about Quagmire-related content captured, even when the complainants would not have framed it this way, was a real structural problem with how the show had been built. Quagmire's function required the show to make his behaviour look light. The lightness was built into the format. The Jigy T was the lightness made audible, and the cumulative effect of 200 episodes of light treatment of serious behaviour is not the same as the cumulative effect of 200 jokes about something inconsequential. The show cannot fully escape this. Quagmire is too central to its architecture, too useful, too recognisable. He can't be reformed without removing whatever makes him narratively functional. He can't be condemned without the show condemning a significant portion of its own history. So he stays as he is, useful and uncomfortable, funny and troubling, unchanged from the very first episode in a show where almost everything else has shifted around him. The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire episode is actually a good illustration of how Family Guy's most controversial moments often exist in episodes that are otherwise doing something relatively serious. The main storyline, Cleveland discovering the affair, the marriage ending, the friendship between the four men being tested, is one of the show's more consequential early plots. Cleveland and Loretta's divorce was permanent. It changed the show's ensemble. It led eventually to the Cleveland Show spin-off, which led to 4 seasons of a different programme. And inside that episode, which is doing real narrative work, there is a cutaway about a man receiving an AIDS diagnosis that exists purely to generate a shock laugh with no relationship to anything around it. The cutaway doesn't comment on the main story. It doesn't reflect on any of the characters' situations. It's just there, in the middle of an episode about infidelity and the end of a marriage, extracting a laugh from a terminal disease. The AIDS organisations that responded to the episode were objecting to exactly this. Not to the episode as a whole, not even to Family Guy as a show, but to the specific practice of using a serious health condition as a shock vehicle in a context that stripped it of any human meaning. Their objection was precise and, on its own terms, entirely coherent. The show had no real mechanism for responding to this kind of targeted critique. The cutaway format that gave it so much freedom also insulated it from the kind of reflection a more integrated format might have demanded. The joke either got a laugh or it didn't. If it got a laugh, it stayed. The Sarah Palin situation played out in a slightly more elevated cultural register because it involved a figure who had a significant public platform and the motivation to use it. Palin had been the Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008, barely 2 years before the episode aired. She was one of the most visible political figures in America at the time. Her response to the episode was covered by national news outlets. The controversy had a visibility that most Family Guy content controversies didn't. Andrea Faye Friedman's counterstatement is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it complicated the story in ways that were specifically uncomfortable for everyone who had rushed to condemn the episode. Friedman was not a passive victim of the joke. She was the person who performed it. She had professional agency in the transaction. She was an actor with Down syndrome who had read the script, accepted the role, and delivered the lines. Her assessment of the episode was more positive than Palin's, and her voice, the voice of someone with actual lived experience of the condition the episode was depicting, was in an important sense more relevant to the question of whether the joke was harmful than the voice of a politician whose son had the same condition. None of that resolved the debate, but it added a dimension to it that resisted the straightforward narrative of a powerful show punching down at a vulnerable population. The Carol Burnett case is worth examining a little more closely, because the legal reasoning that resulted in its dismissal tells you something useful about the specific cultural position that Family Guy occupied. The fair use doctrine in American copyright law protects certain kinds of use of copyrighted material. Commentary, criticism, parody, and educational use are the standard categories. Parody, specifically, has been interpreted broadly by American courts to mean the use of a recognizable original work in a way that comments on or transforms that original. Family Guy's use of Burnett's cleaning lady character was, by the standard the judge applied, clearly parody. The character was famous enough that the reference was unmistakable. There was no argument that an audience might mistake it for something original. And parody protection, under American law, doesn't require the parody to be good or thoughtful, or it generally depends on whether it transforms and comments on the original, so to decomment on the original. Family Guy had done that, however crudely. The judge found for the show. Burnett's additional argument about a prior understanding with Fox regarding the use of her work was more interesting from a legal standpoint, though the judge ultimately rejected it. The idea that a performer has ongoing rights in how their creative work is referenced by other programs is not crazy. It's just not how American copyright law currently works. Parody protection is robust. Personal creative legacy is not a legally cognizable category in American courts. Burnett was, by all accounts, gracious in the aftermath. She has said in interviews since that she found the parody itself offensive, but accepted the legal outcome. That combination, personal offence plus acceptance of the legal result, is actually quite a mature response to a situation that many people in her position would have handled worse. The broader legal record that the three cases together create Family Guy in having been sued 3 times and having won twice and settled once effectively established a track record that made it a more defensible property going forward. Any subsequent potential plaintiff would have to contend with the precedent that 3 separate federal court decisions had established, that Family Guy's parody and satire of recognizable public figures and creative works was legally protected expression. That's not a trivial institutional outcome. It made the show, paradoxically, more secure in its ability to keep pushing because the legal framework had been tested and held. The Emmy promotional ad situation is a strange footnote in all of this, a piece of content that was too much even for the show's own promotional apparatus, without the protection of fair use or parody, without a clearly defined comedic frame. Fox pulling its own show's promotional materials because newspapers wouldn't run them suggests that there was at least one line that the show's institutional home was not willing to cross, even in service of self-promotion. The fact that line was in advertising rather than in the actual broadcast content is, if you think about it for a second, very Family Guy. There is a fan theory. It circulates in the corners of the internet where people think carefully about animated television, that Meg's function in the show is best understood not as a victim of bad writing or lazy characterization, but as a deliberate structural choice made very early in the show's history and maintained across every subsequent season. The theory holds that Meg was always going to be the sacrificial element, the character whose marginalization served as a pressure valve for the dysfunction that would otherwise destroy the household. Whether this was a conscious decision from season 1 or something that the writers discovered over time and then systematized is impossible to know from outside the production. But by the time Seahorse Seashell Party made the logic explicit, the pattern had been operating for long enough that retroactively reading it as intentional doesn't require much imaginative effort. What the theory does well is explain something that otherwise seems like a massive inconsistency in the show's characterization. The Griffin family is, in almost every other respect, presented as a family that loves each other. Peter loves Lois, Lois loves her children, even when she's not particularly. Stewie and Brian form warm attachments that the show returns to regularly. And yet the same family that generates these genuine emotional bonds treats Meg with a cruelty that, across 25 years, has no parallel in how they treat anyone else. The explanation that the theory offers is the one that Meg herself offers in Seahorse Seashell Party, that the cruelty is structural rather than personal, that Meg isn't the target because they don't love her. She's the target because someone has to be, and the family has collectively organised itself around her willingness to absorb that function. where the show went too far with Meg's treatment, and this is a different kind of going too far from most of the examples in this video, was in the number of seasons it ran the dynamic without the compensating layer. Seahorse Seashell Party makes the dynamic legible, but the dynamic operated for 9 seasons before that episode aired. 9 seasons of jokes at Meg's expense that had no frame around them, no layer of meaning, no suggestion that the show was doing anything other than finding her marginalisation funny. Some of those 9 seasons produced content that is, stripped of the later context, simply mean. It functions as mockery of a pathetic character without the analytical distance that later episodes provided. Whether the later episodes retroactively dignify the earlier ones is something each viewer negotiates for themselves. My instinct is that the answer is partly yes and partly no, which is an unsatisfying answer, but probably an accurate one. The episode Meg Stinks, Season 12, and a handful of others across the middle seasons tried to give Meg moments of genuine recognition without abandoning the fundamental dynamic. They worked to varying degrees. The show could not entirely abandon the dynamic. Too much of its comedic machinery depended on it, but it could occasionally offer something that acknowledged what the dynamic was costing. Those acknowledgements are more frequent in later seasons than in earlier ones. The show over time developed a slightly more complicated relationship with what it was doing to Meg, even as it kept doing it. That's not redemption, but it's something. The Cleveland show spin-off had a complicated relationship with the question of race and representation that prefigured the 2020 recast debate in ways worth acknowledging. When the spin-off was announced in 2009, one of the arguments made in its favour was that it would give Cleveland Brown, a character who had existed primarily as a supporting player in an ensemble dominated by a white family, a larger creative canvas. He would be the centre of his own show. His family would be the focus. The relationships around him would be black relationships, explored in a context that the Family Guy format had never made room for. That argument was not wrong, but it coexisted with the fact that the character was still being voiced by a white actor. Mike Henry brought warmth and consistency to Cleveland across the run of both shows. His performance was, on its own terms, good work. But the show was, for 11 years across 2 programs, centered on a black character whose voice came from someone who wasn't. The 2020 moment arrived with a particular force because it was not just about Family Guy. The conversation was about how animation had handled race for decades, how characters of colour in animated shows had routinely been voiced by white actors without significant industry discussion. The simultaneous recasting of multiple characters across multiple shows made it clear this was a systemic issue rather than an individual one. And that framing changed the nature of the conversation from Mike Henry specifically did something wrong to the industry had a practice that was worth examining. Henry's statement was clean. He didn't defend himself. He didn't equivocate. He said the role didn't belong to him and stepped aside. That decision required a kind of professional generosity that isn't automatic. Giving up something you've done well for 21 years because the context around it has changed requires a specific kind of character that not everyone in his position demonstrated. Zahir's tenure has been, from a craft standpoint, successful. He absorbed the character and made the transition seamless enough that most viewers adjusted quickly. The show around Cleveland remained consistent, and the act of the recast, the institutional acknowledgement that something needed to change, became part of the show's record in a way that the show hadn't always been good at building. One thing the recast couldn't change, and presumably wasn't intended to change, is the content of the episodes that preceded it. Those episodes exist. The characterization decisions embedded in them exist. The specific jokes, the specific storylines, the specific ways in which Cleveland was written across 21 seasons exist as they were made. The recast is not a revision, it's a course correction for the work going forward, not a redaction of the work that came before. That distinction matters. The show's history is its history. What the recast changed is its present and its future. And given that the show has been running since 1999, the gap between where it started and where it is now has become one of the more interesting distances in American television, one that no simple account can quite cover. The Brian arc's aftermath had a quality to it that went beyond the usual fan response to a controversial television decision. The grief response to Brian's death was not the same kind of response that, say, a character death in a drama generates. Drama deaths are expected to produce grief. That's what they're designed for. Family Guy had spent years training its audience not to take character deaths seriously. Death was a punchline on Family Guy. It was a throwaway. Major characters had died and returned in the same episode without explanation. The show's relationship with death as a narrative concept was fundamentally comedic. Brian's death broke that conditioning, not because the death itself was executed differently from other Family Guy deaths. It was handled with more care than most, but it was still a cartoon death in a comedy series. It broke the conditioning because of what Brian meant to the audience as a character. Brian was the character who wanted things and couldn't quite get them. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to love someone who loved him back with the same intensity. He was the character the show had given aspirations to, and then given the structural inability to fulfill those aspirations, which is, when you think about it, a fairly devastating comic premise extended across 15 years. The audience's grief was grief for a character they had watched fail repeatedly and forgiven repeatedly because the failure was recognisable. Brian's aspirations were ordinary human aspirations expressed through the absurdist format of an adult animated comedy, and when the show removed him, even temporarily, the thing that was removed was the specific kind of relatability that Brian embodied. Vinny, the replacement dog voiced by Tony Sirico, was a perfectly reasonable character in isolation. The performance was warm, the premise was solid, but the audience wasn't looking for a reasonable replacement. They were looking for the specific emotional function that Brian served, and Vinny couldn't provide it because that function had been built over 15 years of accumulated character history that Vinny didn't have. The two-episode absence also raised a legitimate craft question about the show's use of emotional manipulation. Family Guy has always been willing to use genuine emotional content when it served a comedic or narrative purpose. The show understood, particularly in its best middle seasons, that comedy could land harder when it had an emotional foundation. But using genuine emotional content in a way that the show knew it was going to reverse, asking the audience for grief and then giving it back, is a different transaction. It's asking for something under false pretenses. Whether McFarlane's account of the arc being planned from the beginning is accurate, the effect on the audience was the same, regardless of the intention. The audience was asked to grieve and then told the grief had been provisional. The petitions, the low IMDb scores, the sustained conversation about whether the arc was a mistake, all of it reflects an audience that felt it had given something real and received something calculated in return. Whether that's fair is one of those questions that fans and writers probably answer differently, even now. The Jesus episodes are worth a brief look because they tell you something about where the show's actual limits were. Jesus appeared as a recurring character across seasons 3 through 10, usually in context designed to deflate his canonical significance. In one episode, he drives a sports car. In another, he turns up at a party. The comedy was about incongruity, divine figure, ordinary situation, which is, to be fair, a joke that religious satire has been making for a very long time. The show wasn't doing anything particularly original there. It was just doing it on primetime Fox, which is a different proposition. What the show was notably more careful about was depicting Jesus in ways that engaged directly with the theological claims of Christianity. The show mocked the institutional church. It mocked the behaviour of people who claimed religious authority. It did not particularly mock the content of Christian belief at a doctrinal level. That asymmetry was probably partly strategic. A show that engaged with doctrinal theology would have been engaging with something that a significant portion of its audience took seriously in ways that went beyond cultural habit. The show preferred the cultural habit as its target because the cultural habit was easier to satirize without alienating a large part of its audience. The post-9/11 handling of Islamic content in the show is the most striking example of the asymmetry in Family Guy's religious comedy. The show applied a different standard to Islamic content than to Christian or Jewish content, and the reason for that differential treatment was never explicitly stated but was broadly understood in the industry. After September 2001, American entertainment navigated the intersection of comedy and Islam with a caution that it did not apply to other religions. This was a real phenomenon across American television and film, not specific to Family Guy. The PTC objected to the show's religious content primarily as a category. The organization's position was broadly anti-blasphemy rather than specifically targeted at the show's treatment of any individual faith. Their complaints about episodes featuring God or Jesus coexisted with their complaints about Katie Wagmeyer and Meg and everything else. For the PTC, the religious content was one item on a longer list. What MacFarlane's own religious views contributed to the show's tone is a matter the show's public record allows some inference about. He has described himself as an atheist in public interviews on multiple occasions. His skepticism about organised religion is not hidden, and the show's treatment of religious institutions as corrupt, hypocritical, or simply absurd reflects a consistent, authorial perspective. That perspective generated controversy, but it was also an honest expression of where the show's creator actually stood. Whether that honesty is a virtue or simply an explanation is probably a question of where you sit. People who share MacFarlane's skepticism tend to read the religious comedy as pointed and fair. People who don't tend to read it as gratuitous. Both readings are available, and the show has never made a very strong effort to resolve the ambiguity. The story of MacFarlane's missed flight gets told a certain way in most contexts, as a remarkable personal fact, as an almost unbelievable piece of biographical coincidence, as the kind of thing that makes you consider the fragility of any given life and any given timeline. All of that is true, but there's another dimension to it that gets less attention, which is what the story says about the show's actual relationship with the September 11th attacks as a subject. Family Guy had, by the time the attacks happened, already been cancelled once. No, wait. The show had been renewed for season 3 and was still in production in September 2001. The cancellation came the following year. MacFarlane was still an active producer of an active show when he sat in that airport lounge and watched the news coverage on the monitors. The show's subsequent history is littered with moments where September 11th appears indirectly, in the turban cowboy situation, most obviously, but also in various political and cultural references across the seasons that reflect a post-9/11 America without explicitly addressing the attacks. Family Guy made references to American foreign policy in the post-2001 period. It made references to the war on terror. It engaged with the cultural and political landscape that the attacks created. What it didn't do, and this is actually a fairly notable absence given the show's willingness to engage with almost every other contemporary subject, was make the September 11th attacks themselves a comic subject. The show that made jokes about the Boston Marathon didn't make the same kind of joke about the World Trade Center. Whether that was because MacFarlane's personal connection to the event made it different, or because the show calculated that it was simply beyond the range of effective comedy, or both, is not publicly recorded. The turban cowboy situation illuminated this indirectly. The episode's terrorist subplot had been written without any particular reference to September 11th. It was a satirical treatment of American suspicion of Muslim American citizens, not a treatment of the specific attack. But the combination of that subplot with the Boston Marathon gag created an episode that, after April 2013, could not be separated from a particular cultural context of real-world violence. That context was not about September 11th, but it was about the same general territory. There is a version of the story where the 15 minutes that saved MacFarlane's life in September 2001 produced a show that was more careful about certain subjects than it would otherwise have been. A show that understood, from personal experience, that some things were too close and too real to be turned into comedy. There's no way to verify that. The show's content doesn't offer a clean case for it, but it's worth holding alongside the rest of the record. The survival story has a function in the mythology of Family Guy that is worth noticing. It explains the show's continued existence in a way that bypasses the usual narrative of creative merit or audience loyalty. The show exists because of a hangover. It exists because a travel agent wrote down the wrong time. It exists because of the specific and completely arbitrary arrangement of events on one particular night in Rhode Island in September 2001. That arbitrariness is part of what makes the story stick. And it's part of what makes the show's entire subsequent history feel, in retrospect, a little fragile, a little contingent, a little dependent on things that had nothing to do with the show itself. The choice to make Send in Stewie, Please, the show's 300th episode was deliberate and worth considering as an editorial decision. The 100th episode of a long-running show is typically a celebration, a retrospective, a clip show, a moment of self-congratulation. The 200th is similar. The 300th episode of Family Guy could have been a party. Instead, it was a therapist's office and 22 minutes of a character having a breakdown. That choice reflects something true about the show's relationship with its own milestone moments. Family Guy has never been particularly comfortable with uncomplicated celebration. The show's relationship with its own history is complicated enough that a straightforward anniversary episode would have felt dishonest. So instead, the 300th episode asked the question that the show had been avoiding for 17 seasons. Who is Stewie Griffin, actually, when nobody's watching? The answer, according to the episode, is someone who has been performing for so long that the performance has become load-bearing. The English accent, the schemes, the elaborate vocabulary, the weapons development, these are not expressions of who Stewie is. They are the structure that holds up the space where who Stewie is would otherwise be. Take away the performance, and there's a child who doesn't know how to exist without it. That's not a particularly original insight about human psychology. People perform versions of themselves all the time, and the performance often becomes, over time, more real than whatever was underneath it. But it is a surprising thing to find in an episode of Family Guy, articulated with enough precision and emotional honesty to catch an audience off guard. The performance after the therapist's death is the episode's darkest moment, and it's done quietly. Stewie rebuilds his defences not in a dramatic moment, but in a few small choices. The accent returns, the vocabulary readjusts, the posture changes. The show observes this with complete neutrality. It doesn't score it as tragic. It doesn't score it as comic. It just watches a character decide to be who he always was, rather than risk being who he might be. Seth MacFarlane's voice work in the episode is worth noting specifically. He has voiced Stewie for 25 years, and the performance in Send in Stewie, Please is different from the standard Stewie in ways that are quite subtle. The defences dropping sounds different from the defences being up. The moment when Stewie admits he's lonely is delivered with a quietness that doesn't call attention to itself. It's the kind of performance you'd expect from an actor who has been living inside a character for long enough to know exactly what that character sounds like when it's not performing. The episode won an Emmy nomination. It didn't win. Whether it should have is the kind of debate that emerges from the category it was in: outstanding character, voiceover performance, which puts Family Guy in competition with programs that are consistently taken more seriously as artistic endeavours. But the episode is there, and it remains, 25 years into Family Guy's run, one of the most honest things the show ever made, which might be exactly why it was also the most unsettling. There's a particular kind of self-awareness that functions as a preemptive defense, a way of inoculating content against criticism by acknowledging the criticism before it arrives. I know this is problematic as a setup, deployed so that the punchline can be, and I'm going to do it anyway. Family Guy has used this construction many times across its run. It's a real comedic technique. It can produce results that are actually funny, and it can also function as a way of getting away with something by making the audience complicit in the awareness. The question of whether that kind of self-awareness is honest or cynical depends on what the show does with it. If the awareness produces content that engages with its own implications, that's one thing. If the awareness is just the warning label on something the show would have done regardless, that's another. Family Guy's record on this is a real mixture. The PTV episode uses self-awareness in the first way. It engages directly with the implications of the FCC battle and makes an actual argument through the comedy, rather than just gesturing at the argument. The Meg-as punching bag dynamic, by the time Seahorse Seashell Party articulated it, had been operating for 9 seasons without the articulation. The awareness arrived long after the practice had been established. What the show has been consistently good at, across its full run, is the use of Brian as a vehicle for the show's self-critique. Brian wants to be taken seriously as a writer. The show routinely demolishes that aspiration. His novel is terrible, his screenplays are failures. His intellectual pretensions exceed his actual talent. This is the show criticising its own pretensions through the character most associated with them. It's a fairly sophisticated piece of institutional self-mockery, and it's been running since season 1 alongside everything else. MacFarlane's public engagements with criticism of the show has evolved over the years. In the early seasons, he was more combative, willing to argue directly with specific criticisms, to defend individual jokes, to push back against the PTC with the kind of energy that suggested the opposition was still surprising to him. By the middle and later seasons, the combativeness had settled into something more measured. He had a record of having made the arguments and having kept making the show regardless, and the record spoke for itself. The show's relationship with its own legacy is probably the most interesting element of its self-awareness at this point in its run. With 450 plus episodes and 26 years of production, Family Guy has to navigate its own history in ways that most television shows don't have to, because most television shows don't run long enough. When you've been on the air since 1999, your early seasons are a different cultural document from your recent ones. The show that premiered after the Super Bowl and the show that aired its season 24 premiere in February 2026 are recognisably the same show, but they exist in fundamentally different contexts. The self-awareness that threads through both of them has had to evolve to accommodate what the show has become, as well as what it was when it started. That evolution is ongoing. The show is still being made, the self-awareness is still being deployed, and the question of whether it's doing something useful with that awareness, or simply using it to stay comfortable, is one that each new season has the opportunity to answer, one episode at a time. The show's distribution arrangement in 2025 and 2026 is, when you consider what the show went through between 2002 and 2005, a fairly remarkable situation. A programme that Fox cancelled because it couldn't build a stable broadcast audience is now, 20 years later, split across Fox Broadcast, a dedicated Hulu streaming arrangement, a Comedy Central deal that began in 2024, and an Adult Swim return in 2025. The show occupies more distribution infrastructure now than it ever did during its original run. This expansion reflects something real about the change in how television content is valued. The broadcast audience for any individual Family Guy episode in 2025 is significantly smaller than the equivalent figure from 2001. But the show's ongoing relevance, its continued ability to generate discourse, to be watched in marathon sessions on streaming platforms by audiences who weren't alive when it premiered, to be referenced and quoted and argued about, is what justifies the investment in its continued production and its increasingly complex distribution. The 25th anniversary timing also coincided with a moment of genuine critical reassessment of the show. Not universal rehabilitation. Family Guy has never been particularly well regarded by television critics, and that hasn't changed, but a more nuanced conversation about its place in American animated television than was common in the PTC and FCC years, when the dominant critical narrative was primarily about whether the show should be on the air at all. The conversation in 2024 was more interested in what the show had actually done over 25 years and what it meant for the genre it had helped shape. The adult animated comedy boom that followed Family Guy's revival is part of that legacy. Shows like American Dad, which MacFarlane also created, premiering in 2005, and the broader expansion of the adult animation genre across streaming platforms in the 2010s and 2020s are developments that the Family Guy revival made possible in very direct ways. The DVD sales model that brought Family Guy back was cited as a paradigm shift by industry analysts at the time, and it influenced how networks and studios thought about cancelled properties for years afterward. Not all of that influence has been positive. The cutaway format that Family Guy pioneered has been imitated by dozens of subsequent shows with varying degrees of craft. The willingness to deploy shock content as comedy has been absorbed into the broader DNA of adult animation in ways that sometimes reflect the worst of Family Guy's tendencies without any of its better instincts. The show's legacy is not simply a record of its own content, it's also a record of what the industry did with the templates it created. Whether Family Guy is proud of all its descendants is a question the show has never specifically addressed. It has acknowledged the template. There are episodes that play with the cutaway format in ways that comment on the format itself. But the broader ecosystem of adult animated comedy that followed the revival is something the show exists within rather than comments on, which is probably the appropriate relationship. The renewal through season 28 means Family Guy will almost certainly reach its 30th anniversary on the air. That's a number that puts it in a category occupied by almost no other television program in American history. The Simpsons is the obvious comparison, and it's one the show has directly and repeatedly engaged with. Whatever you think about Family Guy's record over those 3 decades, the longevity is a fact, and the longevity creates a kind of authority, not moral authority, not critical authority, but the simple authority of having survived. The show went too far, it kept going, and it will probably keep going until it decides not to, or until Fox decides otherwise, whichever comes first. A few things worth sitting with before we close that didn't find a clean home in the sections above. The show's relationship with its own guest stars across the years is part of its going too far record in ways that don't always get discussed separately. Family Guy used celebrity guest voices more aggressively than most animated shows, and the way it used them, often placing recognizable figures in compromising fictional situations, occasionally generated its own category of complaint. Celebrities who appeared on the show sometimes found that their fictional counterparts were made to do or say things that pushed against what they'd agreed to. The show's record on this is uneven in ways that parallel its record on everything else. The show's handling of real news events and political figures across its long run is also worth noting as a running category. Family Guy has not been shy about addressing current events. It has made jokes about real politicians, real crimes, real disasters, with the usual mixture of sharpness and recklessness that characterizes the show's relationship with any subject. Some of those jokes have aged poorly, Some of them were wrong in ways the show made those jokes about current events, with a significant production lead time, not live in real time, and the record reflects that. The record reflects that. Whether Family Guy has been a net positive or a net negative for the culture it was produced in doesn't have a clean answer. It pushed limits that may have needed pushing. It also made content that was mean without being meaningful, provocative without being insightful, and shocking without earning it. Both of those things have coexisted in the same show for a long time now, and the show has never made a serious effort to resolve the tension between them. What's harder to argue with is the plain fact of its survival. A show this consistently at odds with its own broadcast context, with regulators, with advertisers, and advocacy groups and standards departments, has been running since 1999. Not because it behaved, because it kept going when everything around it suggested it should stop. That persistence is its own argument. Whether it's a good argument probably depends on which episode you last watched. One last thing before we actually close. The show's relationship with the city of KWOHOG, a fictional Providence, Rhode Island, is worth mentioning as a quiet counterpoint to everything we've discussed. KWOHOG is an affectionate portrait of a specific kind of American place. It has a working-class waterfront character, a sense of community that persists through catastrophe, a cast of neighborhood figures who know each other and show up for each other in the ways that long-established communities do. The show, it keeps the town familiar across 27 years of content, 6 years of content. The clam is still the clam. The Griffin House is still the Griffin House. The neighborhood is still the neighborhood. That affection sits alongside everything else the show is. Alongside the lawsuits and the banned episodes and the FCC battles and the 40-plus worst show of the week citations. And it doesn't resolve the tension. It doesn't make the problematic parts less problematic. But it does suggest that the show was never only about provocation. There was always something it was trying to protect alongside everything it was willing to destroy. A place, a family, a neighborhood that looks the same at the end of every episode, regardless of what happened in it. Repeatedly, across 27 years, in more ways than we've had time to cover tonight. And it also kept coming home. The credits roll. The lights go down. Peter is still in the chair. Lois is still on the couch. The kids are wherever they are. And KWOHOG is still there, small and improbable and impossible to locate on any real map, surviving everything the show throws at it, which is perhaps more than the show deserves, and perhaps exactly as much as any of us ever really need. Good night.